Hello everybody. I mentioned in my last video that I would be redirecting the focus of my content going forward. It's not that I won't comment on South African politics again, but it's just that that was never intended to be the main focus of this channel. It is one small manifestation of my main objective, which is to do my own small part in preserving and promoting the what I consider to be endangered Western Judeo-Christian culture, and also gaining a better understanding of it myself as I go. My first several videos have mostly been concerned with political developments in South Africa, as well as a few commentaries on political events in the UK, the US, and Canada, because that's what was preoccupying me at the time. And these topics are relevant to my overall theme because much of what we see in the political events of the day is a result of and feeds back into the decline of the West. However, as I'm sure many other people are as well, I'm feeling rather fatigued by all of that. There will be times when I will go back to the topic, but I want to start looking at other more interesting things. Now, don't think, for example, that I haven't noticed the South African National Defense Force's growing friendship with the Islamic Republic of Iran, or that this doesn't terrify and enrage me in equal measure, or, for that matter, the fiasco that is the national dialogue. But I won't be looking at these or similar matters today. As I said last time, nothing in the political sphere surprises me, and while of course there are always new events unfolding, there is nothing new to report in terms of the cultural patterns and behavior we observe in South African politics and society. It's just more of the same. So for now, let's forget about the news. This video is the start of an exploration of a different area of interest, one infinitely more important to me, and that is the Western literary canon, particularly as a representative and codification of everything that I believe is great about the West, and everything I think it is rapidly losing. Since we are approaching Heritage Day in South Africa, I will begin this exploration in light of that subject. Why do I make this my focus? Well, because heritage is something that means a great deal to me in both a personal and cultural sense, and it is also a fairly contentious matter in this country. One of the biggest problems with the West, and what I would call the post-Western world, of which South Africa is a part, in its current postmodern, post-Christian, post-literary malaise, is that the majority of us have forgotten our heritage. And those of us who haven't forgotten it are being told that we should. In the mainstream, our heritage is merely considered boring. On the leftist fringes of the mainstream, which has set the cultural agenda for the past few decades, our heritage is a problem that needs to be solved, perhaps even a tumor that needs to be removed. Consider the current flag rebellion going on in the United Kingdom, of which it may not surprise you to know I'm in full support. It is perfectly acceptable to fly the flag of Palestine or whatever country you wish, but flying the St. George's Cross or the Union Jack, the actual national flags, makes you some kind of public enemy. So what do I mean by the word heritage? I would describe it in its simplest terms as a civilization's cultural content, passed down and developed through multiple generations, and by extension, the basis for that civilization's values. In the West, that includes the achievements and knowledge that have aggregated to us for centuries in areas such as science, philosophy, music, imaginative fiction, economics, law, theology, history, etc. Since we in the Judeo-Christian world are, as the Muslims like to describe us, people of the book, in more ways than one, most of this heritage has been recorded, discussed, debated, and developed in an ever-growing literary corpus that dates back to the Old Testament and Homer's Odyssey, in ideas generated and recorded by quote-unquote dead white men. There was a time when the most important literary works of our canon were routinely taught as part of a well-rounded, what was then called liberal education. Now, I would hesitate to use the word liberal in this context, but anyway. By the time I reached high school, in the 1990s, that tradition had dwindled to the barest remnant. In English class, we had, well, pretty much the one Shakespeare play per year, often dreaded and barely understood or tolerated by the majority of students. In science, maths, and biology, the syllabus taught us principles, methods that were just accepted as part of the educational program, but completely divorced from the tradition that generated them, or the people who developed them. For example, we studied the laws of motion and the calculus, with barely any thought given to who Isaac Newton was and why his work was significant, or the extent to which it had been disputed or expanded upon by his contemporaries and later theorists. I mean, I spent 2 years in high school learning how to do logarithms and differential calculus without ever actually being told what they represented or what they were used for. These, to me, are signs of a culture gradually losing its moorings. And today, nearly 30 years after I completed my education, those moorings are pretty much cut loose. And particularly now with drives to decolonize the culture. By decolonize is generally meant remove any remnants of Western culture, even in the West, for some strange reason. How does this concern us here in South Africa? Well, here is a controversial opinion. I was born South African, but I'm a Westerner from the top of my head to the tips of my toes. And that does not make me any less South African. The prevailing idea now is that the true South African identity must come only from the Bantu culture, or perhaps including the San culture into that as well. So that is Zulu, Xhosa, Swazi, Ndebele, Sotho, Pedi, Tswana, Venda, and Songa cultures. These are supposedly all authentically South African, and the Anglo and Boer cultures are foreign transplants, alien species superimposed onto the already existing South African culture by force, and which can now be tolerated or discarded at the discretion of the true South Africa. Of course, not everyone holds this opinion, but it is alarmingly widespread in my experience. Not only is that offensive and racist, it's ahistorical. The truth is that South Africa is made up of all these cultures. All of them are integral to the nation's history and identity. South Africa as we know it would not exist without any one of them. To remove or denigrate one is to impoverish the collective national heritage. I don't care if anyone disagrees, I hold this to be an incontrovertible fact. My Englishness is not in conflict with my South Africanness. It is integral to it. In the same way that Britain as we know it would not exist without the various waves of Anglo-Saxon settlement in the 5th and 6th centuries, in addition to the existing Celtic and Romano-Briton cultures, so South Africa would not exist without the influence of all its constituent population groups, but, I hasten to add, perhaps controversially, most especially British, Zulu, and Boer. The idea that true South African identity is some kind of homogeneous mass of black Africanness is a post-colonial myth. That's a hard historical fact, and we need to deal with it. Part of understanding, accepting, and propagating my own culture, therefore, does not consist in forgetting my Englishness, my Westernness, and adopting some or other thing that might be considered more South African. I am called upon, as we all are, to preserve the heritage passed on to me by my own ancestors. And I can do that while still recognizing the other heritages that make up the country and indeed the world. Respecting your culture doesn't mean abandoning my own. The biggest problem is not people of other cultures who either misunderstand or dislike Western culture. They have always been there. The real problem is we Westerners ourselves, who fail to propagate our own heritage. There are some who are simply ignorant of their heritage, partly through the fault of their elders and partly their own. But then, of course, there are those who actively oppose their own heritage and feel it needs to be replaced either with some revolutionary, quote-unquote, new ideas, as if there is such a thing, or with some other culture that is purportedly better. If either of these ways of thinking, or not thinking, as the case may be, persists and spreads, the demise of the culture is only a question of time. Destruction comes either willfully or inadvertently, but the effect is the same. I'm reminded of a quote from Jordan Peterson's latest book, We Who Wrestle with God. I quote, "This narrative trope indicates, in part, that cultures who concentrate too much on what passes for present wisdom, that is, we can dispense with the superstitious foolishness of the past, quote unquote, will lose the vertical traditional orientation that protects them against mere fads of consensus. There is a cumulative wisdom in mankind, but it is not a mere consequence of the incessant noise and clamor of the present day. It is instead something that has been gathered across an immense span of time, in many situations, and is a consequence of the observations and reminiscences of many cultures. Its rejection in favor of the whim-possessed idiocy, even of the collective present, is all too often a precursor to the Crimson Flood, particularly when those whims are, as they are wont to be, hedonistic, power-mad, revolutionary, and political. If Westerners anywhere in the world, and I guess I'm speaking specifically but by no means exclusively to Anglophones like myself, have any hope of stemming what Peterson refers to as the Crimson Flood, we need to start by remembering and reclaiming our heritage. And that can be in a number of ways, but one of them is to rediscover our literary heritage in particular. At this point, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to take a slight autobiographical tour, which will bring me back to the main point. Sometime in the 1970s, before I was born, an encyclopedia salesman showed up at my parents' door. Encyclopedia salesman, what a concept. So he worked for Britannica, or whoever it was that was distributing Britannica in South Africa in those days. And he wasn't selling the encyclopedia exactly. His focus was a different set of books that the publishing house was putting out at the time, called The Great Books of the Western World. 54 curated volumes containing what the editors considered to be the defining texts of the Western literary canon, starting with Homer and ending with Freud, and spanning a wealth of different ideas and authors in the intervening centuries, covering fiction, history, philosophy, and the foundations of science and mathematics, among other subjects. Now, my dad was an avid reader, but this was not generally his choice of reading. He tended to focus mostly on military history. So I'm not sure exactly why he chose to place his order, but nevertheless he did. And a decade later, I saw these rather intimidating-looking volumes on the shelves in his study, and thought little of them. About a decade after that, I finally took another look and started to understand what they actually were. And since then, I've dipped in and out of them periodically. No matter how many times I have moved, how many other belongings I have culled over the years, I have always insisted on lugging these rather heavy books around with me wherever I go. This was the case even when I became a virtual nomad in 2016. That's a long story. I recently settled into family life, and so the books are back on the shelf after about 9 years in storage. And so I started reading them again. Now, I'm not saying that these books are the be-all and end-all. I'm not even saying that I enjoy or agree with all of them. To appreciate one's literary heritage, one doesn't have to absorb all the relevant works without question. On the contrary, they should be engaged with critically, especially in connection with one another. The reader is called upon to involve him or herself in the centuries-long conversation that has been carried out through and between these books and their authors. The series came with a companion set called the Great Ideas Program, a set of 10 reading plans designed to break the Great Book series up into digestible portions, divided by genre of subject matter. I decided to start with the 4th reading plan, which focuses on religion and theology. And as I was reading the prefaces in the reading plan, there are 3 or 4 prefaces by different authors, I was struck by one written by someone named Wilhelm Pauck, who at the time of publication, I believe this would have been in the 1960s, was a professor of church history at the Union Theological Seminary in New York. I quote, "A person of culture is one who is enlightened concerning the things of the mind and able to make competent judgments about them. Most men yearn to become such persons. Therefore, they seek education, That is, they desire that one should lead them to the sources of knowledge. Sooner or later, they learn that they can reach these sources only by entering upon the whole cultural legacy which has been left to them by their fathers and predecessors. They thus become cultured as they appropriate this heritage for themselves and make it their own, and then try to fit it to their own lives by relating it to the values which they wish to see cultivated and which they hope will be embodied in civilization. In other words, men share in the life and upbuilding of civilization insofar as they relate responsibly to the heritage of the past, that is, the cultural achievements of the generations that have gone before them, first by appropriating it for themselves, and then by weighing and evaluating it according to their needs and insights, and thus transforming it in order finally to transmit it to their children. Cultural knowledge is always historical knowledge, and historical knowledge is not merely an acquaintance with past human achievements, but it is primarily the exercise of cultural responsibility by way of critical assessment of such achievements, a judgment that will mean either their arrestment or their preservation and development in new situations. He then quotes some lines from Goethe's Faust. German speakers, please excuse my pronunciation. Was du ererbt von deinem Vater hast, erwirb es, es zu besitzen. Was man nicht nützt, ist eine schwere Last. Nur was der Augenblick erschafft, das kann nützen. There are many different translations in print for this, but the one he quotes is as follows. Wouldst thou possess thy heritage, essay by use to render it thine own. What we employ not, but impedes our way, that which the hour creates, that it can use alone. Basically, if anyone desires to be cultured, that is, to understand one's own culture and contribute to it, and propagate it, one has first to grasp and appreciate the culture itself and the achievements that have contributed to it. Only then can one begin to make a meaningful contribution to its furtherment, even if that means, after careful consideration, both critical and charitable, modifying, integrating, or discarding an idea embedded in the culture at an earlier time. However, for the reasons discussed above with my reference to Jordan Peterson, the modification or rejection of existing cultural achievements or ideas have to be done responsibly, respectfully, and cautiously, and knowledgeably. This is in stark contrast to the revolutionary zeal of today's critical theorists, whose destructive ideas are soaking deeper into Western culture, especially because the majority of people are not well enough informed, never having appropriated this heritage themselves. Critical theorists are actually not particularly critical in the truest sense, and they are certainly not charitable. A critical and charitable reading of a text involves a careful, objective judgment of the text on its merits, comprehending its historical and cultural context, and balancing it with those of the reader. Critical theory as we know it today is hell-bent on assessing the Western canon through an ahistorical, anti-Western ideological lens by people who feel it is their mission to decolonize knowledge and culture, so of course they will always find it wanting. I have appropriated a fraction of this cultural material myself, and I am now undertaking to explore more of it more deeply, starting with these books that my father bought years before I was born, and which have spent far too much time either just decorating bookshelves or packed away in storage. I encourage everyone who values our Western heritage or would like to find out more about it or understand it better to do something similar. My own small contribution will involve creating videos and podcasts in the coming weeks and months about the reading plans as I progress through them. And this will constitute an ongoing series starting next week with the first reading in the Religion and Theology reading plan, that is the Greek tragedy Prometheus Bound, which is conventionally attributed to Aeschylus, although its exact origin is uncertain. Aside from that, I must just add that my two outstanding videos on the South African experiment are still incoming. So those of you who are still waiting for those, they are on their way. I know they're taking a while. Got a bit stuck on the second one because it's extremely tricky to try to take an objective look at the apartheid era. So I've just been very careful about assessing and editing my content so that it comes out as I intend it to. But anyway, that's on the way soon. Thank you to all of you who have listened this far. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. I will be posting every Friday or Saturday from now on. And if you have any thoughts, be sure to write them in the comments below. I'll chat to you soon. Cheers.